Have you ever cried so hard at night that you wondered if even God had stopped listening? Ethan Walker knew that feeling. Every day he wore a smile, but every night he sat alone in the dark, carrying fears he couldn't explain. He prayed, waited, and heard nothing. The silence felt unbearable. Then he discovered something hidden in the story of Hannah. God's silence is not God's absence. While Ethan searched for answers, God was already watching every tear, shaping something deeper inside him. And the moment he finally understood what God sees in our darkest nights changed everything in a way he never expected. Have you ever stared into the darkness long after everyone else was asleep and wondered if anyone truly knew how much you were hurting? Not the version of you that smiles at work, answers messages, and says, "I'm fine." The real you. The exhausted you. The one carrying silent battles that nobody can see. If that sounds familiar, dear friend, then this story is already about you. Some pain is loud, but the deepest pain is often the quiet kind. It hides behind routine, behind responsibility, behind the brave face we show the world. And sometimes the hardest part is not the struggle itself. It is the feeling that no one notices. Ethan Walker knew that feeling well. Night after night, he sat alone in his small apartment in Colorado, surrounded by silence that seemed heavier than words. During the day, people saw a capable man moving through life. But when darkness filled the room, the weight he carried became impossible to ignore. He would sit on the edge of his bed, staring into the shadows, asking questions he was almost afraid to say out loud. Why does it hurt this much? How much longer can I keep going? Have you ever noticed how loneliness feels different at night? The same problems that seem manageable during the day can suddenly feel overwhelming when you are alone with your thoughts. Ethan felt trapped between faith and fear, hope and disappointment. Yet hidden within that struggle was a truth he could not see. Sometimes the moments when we feel most forgotten become the moments that reveal what has been holding us all along. But on this night, Ethan did not know that yet. All he knew was that tears were falling, and the darkness felt endless. The next morning, nothing looked different. The sun still rose over the mountains, people still rushed through their routines, and Ethan still put on the same calm expression he had worn for months. Yet inside, he felt as if he were carrying a weight nobody else could see. Perhaps you know that feeling too. The strange exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from pretending you are okay when you are not. Ethan wasn't just fighting problems around him. He was fighting a war within himself. Part of him wanted to keep believing that things would get better. Another part whispered that maybe nothing would ever change. Every disappointment seemed to add another stone to the burden he already carried. The bills, the uncertainty, the loneliness, the unanswered prayers, they all blended together into a quiet ache that followed him everywhere. What made it even harder was the guilt. He believed he should be stronger. He believed his faith should be enough. But the more he struggled, the more ashamed he felt for struggling at all. Isn't it strange how often we judge ourselves for being human? We offer compassion to others while denying it to ourselves. Yet one of life's hidden truths is that weakness does not make a person less worthy of love. Sometimes it simply reveals how deeply they need it. Ethan longed for someone to understand what was happening inside him, but he barely understood it himself. He felt trapped between hope and surrender, between trusting God and questioning whether God was still near. Still, beneath all the confusion, a small spark remained alive. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was there. And perhaps that is another quiet truth of life. Even when hope feels gone, it often survives in places we cannot yet see. That evening, Ethan found himself sitting in the same familiar silence. The problems had not disappeared. The questions still lingered. The ache in his heart was still there. Yet something felt different, though he could not explain why. Sometimes change does not arrive like thunder. Sometimes it begins as a whisper. Ethan stared at the ceiling and replayed the months behind him. He thought about all the nights he had spent carrying his burdens alone, trying to be strong, trying to fix everything himself. The harder he tried, the more exhausted he became. And for the first time, he stopped pretending, even to God. No polished words. No carefully constructed prayers. Just honesty. Just pain. Just a weary heart saying, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Have you ever reached that point where you run out of explanations? Where all that remains is the truth of how deeply you hurt? Strange as it may seem, That moment can become the beginning of something new. Not because the pain suddenly disappears, but because honesty opens a door that pride keeps closed. As Ethan sat there, no miracle happened. No voice filled the room. No answer appeared from heaven. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of relief. It was the relief that comes when a person stops carrying a burden alone, even if only for a moment. One of life's quiet lessons is that healing often begins when we stop hiding our wounds. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is courage wearing a humble face. Ethan did not know it yet, but this simple prayer, raw, broken, and imperfect, would become the first turning point in a journey that was only beginning. For a brief moment after that honest prayer, Ethan thought something inside him had shifted, but the days that followed felt even heavier. The relief he had experienced was real, yet the questions remained. In some ways, they grew louder. He had finally opened his heart, but life around him looked exactly the same. The loneliness was still there. The uncertainty was still there. And a troubling thought began to follow him everywhere. If I have been honest with God, why do I still feel this way? Perhaps you have asked a similar question. We often expect healing to arrive quickly, yet some of life's deepest transformations begin in confusion. The paradox is difficult to accept. Sometimes growth feels more like breaking than becoming. Ethan found himself caught between what he believed and what he felt. He believed God was good. He believed God cared. But his emotions seemed to tell a different story. And when belief and emotion collide, the heart can become a battlefield. He started questioning not only his circumstances, but himself. Was he weak for struggling this much? Was he failing somehow? Why did everyone else seem able to carry their burdens while he felt crushed beneath his? One of the quiet tragedies of human life is that people often compare their private pain to someone else's public strength. Yet every person carries hidden wounds that others never see. The strongest-looking people are often fighting invisible battles. Night after night, Ethan wrestled with thoughts he could not silence. He was no longer just searching for solutions to his problems. He was searching for meaning. What is the purpose of suffering? Why do some prayers seem unanswered? Why does the human heart long so deeply to be seen? And perhaps the hardest question of all lingered in the darkness. If God sees every tear, why does the night sometimes feel so long? There came a night when Ethan could no longer hide from the questions inside his own heart. The apartment was quiet, but his mind was not. He sat alone in the darkness, exhausted from carrying fears he could not solve and hopes he could no longer hold with confidence. He was not angry. He was simply tired. Tired of waiting. Tired of wondering. Tired of trying to stay strong when every part of him felt fragile. And in that vulnerable silence, a painful thought finally surfaced. What if nothing ever changes? Perhaps you have stood in that place before. Not a place where faith disappears, but a place where faith feels painfully distant. A place where you still believe in God, yet struggle to feel His presence. One of the hardest realities of life is that the deepest spiritual battles often happen in complete silence, where nobody can see them except the person enduring them. Ethan lowered his head and wrestled with questions he never thought he would ask. Had he been forgotten? Had his prayers somehow been lost among countless others? Was there meaning in his suffering, or was he simply drifting through a season without purpose? The human heart longs not only for answers, but for assurance that it matters. And when that assurance feels absent, even familiar beliefs can begin to tremble. Yet somewhere beneath the sorrow, a tiny ember remained alive. It was almost impossible to see, like a distant light on the horizon during a stormy night. Ethan could not feel hope clearly, but he had not completely abandoned it either. And perhaps that is the hidden courage many people overlook. Sometimes faith is not confidently declaring that everything will be fine. Sometimes faith is simply remaining seated in the darkness, still willing to whisper one more prayer when every emotion tells you to stop. Ethan did not know it yet, but his lowest moment was bringing him closer to a truth that would change how he understood God forever. In the days after that difficult night, Ethan did not suddenly become stronger. The questions were still there, and many of his circumstances remained unchanged. Yet something subtle began to happen. Instead of constantly searching for explanations, he found himself paying attention to things he had overlooked before. One evening, while sitting quietly with his thoughts, he remembered a story he had heard long ago about Hannah. She carried a sorrow so deep that few people truly understood it. Others saw her outward life, but only God saw the full weight of her heart. For the first time, Ethan stopped focusing on how different their situations were and noticed something more important. Hannah's pain had not meant she was abandoned. In fact, some of the most meaningful moments of her journey happened while she was still waiting. That realization stayed with him. Could it be that suffering and abandonment were not the same thing? We often assume that if life is difficult, something must be wrong. Yet some of the strongest roots grow in seasons nobody celebrates. Some of the most important transformations happen where nobody is watching. Ethan began to see a quiet pattern in human life. We spend so much energy asking, "When will this end?" that we rarely ask, "What might this season be teaching me?" The lesson did not remove his pain, but it changed the way he carried it. He realized that every tear had revealed something honest about his heart, his longing for connection, his need for hope, his desire to be seen and loved. Those desires were not weaknesses. They were reminders of what it means to be human. And perhaps that was the hidden truth he had been missing all along. Pain is not always proof that life is falling apart. Sometimes it is evidence that the heart is still alive, still capable of loving, trusting, and reaching towards something greater, even in the darkness. As Ethan reflected on Hannah's story, he began to notice something that had never fully captured his attention before. The people inside those ancient stories rarely understood the meaning of their struggles while they were living through them. They saw confusion where later generations would see purpose. They saw delays where others would eventually recognize preparation. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult truths for any human heart to accept. We experience life one moment at a time, but meaning often reveals itself only when we can see the larger picture. Ethan thought about the nights he had spent asking why. Why this pain? Why the season? Why this silence? Yet another question slowly emerged beside those familiar ones. What if there is more happening than I can currently see? Not because every hardship has an obvious explanation, but because our perspective is naturally limited. A child looking at a single puzzle piece cannot imagine the beauty of the completed image. In much the same way, we often judge our lives from one painful chapter while the story is still being written. This thought did not erase Ethan's sorrow, but it softened something inside him. He no longer felt quite as trapped by the need to understand everything immediately. Sometimes the burden is not only the pain itself. Sometimes the heavier burden is believing we must make sense of it right now. One of life's gentlest revelations is that trust does not require complete understanding. It only asks us to leave room for possibilities beyond what we can currently see. As the days passed, Ethan began to view his journey differently. Perhaps the unanswered questions were not signs that he was lost. Perhaps they were invitations to keep walking. And perhaps every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty was part of a larger story that would one day make more sense than it did today. For the first time in a long while, the future felt less like a wall and more like a horizon. The circumstances of Ethan's life had not dramatically changed. The same responsibilities greeted him each morning. The same uncertainties waited for him in quiet moments. Yet something within him was no longer responding in the same way. The fear that once consumed every thought had begun to loosen its grip, not because he had solved all his problems, but because he was slowly learning that his worth was not determined by his struggles. For so long, Ethan had measured himself by what he could fix, control, or achieve. When life felt broken, he felt broken too. But now he was beginning to see a different truth. A difficult season does not diminish the value of a human soul. The storm may shake the branches, but it does not change the worth of the tree. This realization brought a quiet kind of freedom. Instead of fighting every painful emotion, he started allowing himself to feel them without shame. He no longer saw sadness as failure or uncertainty as weakness. He began treating himself with the same compassion he would offer a dear friend. And perhaps that is one of the most overlooked forms of courage. Choosing kindness toward yourself when life has been unkind. As this change unfolded, Ethan noticed another transformation. The disappointments that had made him bitter were slowly making him more understanding. He found himself judging others less harshly. He recognized hidden pain behind people's smiles because he had carried hidden pain himself. Suffering had not hardened his heart. Somehow, it was softening it. One of life's beautiful paradoxes is that the wounds we survive often become the places where compassion grows. Ethan still hoped for better days ahead, but he was no longer placing his entire peace in future outcomes. A quiet calm was taking root in the present moment. And for the first time in a very long while, he realized that healing is not always the removal of pain. Sometimes healing is becoming the kind of person who can carry life's burdens without losing their capacity to love, trust, and hope. De ghi nen va seap dung not chuan cho ton bo kak fan teep theo qua series nai. Nguyen tak ka chien kot loi ka bang kam suk truok kai ka bang su kien. Loan bat dao tu ju nu choi zem dang kam nan. Kong bat dao tu du kien he by hawk. Uutn noi dao. Hai vong. Su jong xe. Lon kan dam va qua trin chua lan. Vitro tuk su qua nin vat nu choi zem la nin vat chin tuk su. Ethan Walker chi la tam guang fan chu noi tom qua nuoi zem. Siu moi fan du fi keen nu choi zem cam thay. Du chin la toi. Toi kung tung cam thay nu vei. Toi kong ko don trong tre neum nai. Vitro qua kin ton la ke ka chua lan. Kong fi dike den koi kong. Kong kuchian kin ton de trian, dak kin tuk. Kong bien noi dung ton by hok than hok. Kak nin vat kin ton zut hien de jup nuoi zem, hu chin min. Chua lan chin min va trong ton han. Zhang van jiodong nu mot nuoi mi de yu fuang. Am ap nu mot nuoi ban, trong ton dang goi, kan nuoi dang ton fuang. Kong jiao ju. Kong lin lop. Kong tran wan dung sai. Kong fan zet. Tuet doi kong su dung noi, so de ju chan nuoi zem. Cam jiak toi loi. Ket on. De doa. Jiat gon. Tao tung cam suck. Muk tu qua moi fan sao moi fan. Nu toi zem fine and duokit not mot trong and hung ju sao. Hu ban than han. Bao dung voi ban than han. Tu ti voi nuoi kok han. Kin dam han. Ben and han. Hai vong han. Tin rang min van duok yu fuang. Ka truck cam suck se duway try 2-part 8 den part 13 pain reflection human truth biblical bridge healing insight hope trong du. Pain equals noi dao quin thuok qua nuoi zem. Reflection equals suing gam noi tom. Human truth equals kai ti nan van. Biblical bridge equals lean ket nain hang voi ka chien kinton. Healing insight equals gok nin chua lan. Hope equals tia sang dan nugoi zem di teep. Twiasi ju kakengwen tak nai lam nun tang shuyen sut ton bo kak fan kon lai kwa ka chien. God sees you crying alone at night. One quiet afternoon, nothing extraordinary happened. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no life-changing phone call, no sudden solution waiting at Ethan's door. And yet, for reasons he could not fully explain, he felt lighter. Not because his burdens were gone, but because they no longer seemed to define him. As he sat near the window watching the fading sunlight stretch across the room, he noticed something he had overlooked for months. The future no longer felt like an enemy. It felt uncertain, yes, but not hopeless. Have you ever realized that sometimes the first sign of healing is not happiness, but the return of possibility? Ethan found himself thinking about the small moments he had almost ignored. A kind conversation, a comforting memory, a verse that seemed to arrive at the right time. None of these things solved his problems. Yet together they formed something unexpected, a reminder that life was still offering him reasons to keep moving forward. One of the quiet miracles of the human heart is its ability to rediscover hope in places that once felt empty. The more Ethan reflected, the more he understood that hope is rarely loud. It does not usually arrive with certainty or guarantees. More often, it enters gently, like the first light before sunrise. You cannot fully see the day yet, but you know the darkness is no longer all there is. This realization awakened a deep sense of gratitude within him. Not gratitude because everything was perfect, but gratitude because he had survived days he once thought would break him. And perhaps there is a hidden strength in that recognition. How many times have you endured more than you believed possible? How many times has your heart carried you through seasons you never expected to survive? As Ethan looked ahead, he still did not know exactly what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a very long while, he believed tomorrow was worth meeting. As Ethan looked back on the months that had brought him to this point, he realized something surprising. The greatest change had not been in his circumstances. The greatest change had been in what he expected from life. For so long, he believed peace would arrive after every problem was solved. He believed joy would come once uncertainty disappeared. He believed he could finally rest when everything made sense. But life had gently taught him a different lesson. If peace depends on perfect circumstances, then peace will always remain just beyond reach. Perhaps you have discovered this too. There is always another challenge, another disappointment, another unanswered question waiting around the corner. The human heart can spend years postponing happiness, telling itself, "I will be okay when." Yet that day often keeps moving farther away. Ethan began to understand that peace is not found at the end of uncertainty. It is found in learning how to walk through uncertainty without letting it steal your soul. This realization did not come from a book or a sermon. It came from long nights, honest tears, and the slow work of healing. He thought about Hannah again. Her story was no longer just about waiting for an answer. It was about becoming someone who could keep hope alive while waiting. That perspective changed everything. One of life's deepest forms of wisdom is recognizing that growth often happens in the space between prayer and fulfillment, between longing and arrival. The waiting season is not empty. It is shaping something within us. Ethan also realized that strength is often misunderstood. True strength is not pretending to be unaffected by pain. True strength is remaining open-hearted despite it. It is choosing kindness when you are hurting. It is choosing trust when certainty is unavailable. It is choosing hope when fear seems easier. And perhaps that is the revelation this journey had been leading toward all along. The goal is not to become a person who never struggles. The goal is to become a person who can move through struggle without losing their capacity to love, to trust, and to see beauty in life. One evening, as Ethan sat quietly with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him, he noticed something that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The heaviness was no longer sitting on his chest the way it once had. The memories of disappointment were still there. The unanswered questions had not completely disappeared, yet they no longer controlled every corner of his heart. It was as if he had been carrying a heavy backpack for so long that he forgot what it felt like to set it down. Perhaps you know that feeling too. Sometimes the greatest burden is not the pain itself, but the constant effort of holding on to it. Ethan began to understand that healing is often less about gaining something new and more about releasing what was never meant to be carried forever. He stopped blaming himself for every setback. He stopped replaying old failures as evidence that he was not enough. He stopped demanding that his life unfold according to a perfect timeline. In their place, a gentler voice began to emerge. A voice that said, "You have been doing the best you can. You are allowed to be human. You are allowed to rest." One of the kindest truths we can learn is that acceptance is not giving up. Acceptance is making peace with the reality of where we are so we can move forward with an open heart. As Ethan embraced this truth, he found himself becoming more forgiving, not only toward others, but toward himself. The mistakes he once carried with shame became reminders of lessons learned. The wounds he once tried to hide became places where compassion could grow. Slowly, a deep sense of calm settled within him. Not the fragile calm that depends on circumstances, but the steady kind that comes from knowing you no longer have to fight every battle alone. And in that quiet peace, Ethan discovered something beautiful. The heart begins to heal the moment it realizes it is worthy of the same grace it so freely offers to everyone else. As Ethan's journey continued, he began to realize that the lessons he had learned were not meant only for difficult seasons. They were meant for everyday life. The truth is, most of us spend our days carrying invisible burdens while trying to meet responsibilities, care for loved ones, and keep moving forward. We often believe we need to be stronger, more productive, or more certain before we can feel at peace. Yet Ethan discovered something different. The people who appear strongest are not always those who have the fewest struggles. Often, they are the ones who have learned how to be gentle with themselves while facing them. Think about your family, your friendships, or the people you work beside every day. How many hidden battles might they be carrying that you know nothing about? One of the most meaningful gifts we can offer another person is simple understanding. Sometimes a listening ear heals more than advice. Sometimes kindness reaches places that solutions cannot. Ethan also learned that growth does not always happen through dramatic changes. More often, it happens through small daily choices. Choosing patience when frustration feels easier. Choosing honesty when hiding feels safer. Choosing gratitude for what is present instead of focusing only on what is missing. These moments may seem ordinary, yet they quietly shape the kind of person we become. Another lesson stayed with him wherever he went. Not every unanswered question needs an immediate answer. Some of life's greatest anxieties come from trying to control outcomes that have not yet arrived. There is wisdom in preparing for tomorrow, but there is also peace in fully living today. Perhaps that is something many of us need to remember. The future is important, but our lives are happening now. As Ethan looked at the people around him, he felt a deeper sense of compassion than ever before. Every person was carrying a story. Every heart was fighting a battle. And maybe the most powerful way to move through life is not by becoming invincible, but by becoming more understanding, more present, and more willing to offer the same grace that we hope to receive ourselves. As the seasons slowly changed outside Ethan's window, he realized that the journey he had feared most had quietly given him something precious. Not a life without challenges, not a future without uncertainty, but a heart that no longer felt alone. The questions that once kept him awake every night no longer carried the same power over him. Some remained unanswered, and perhaps they always would. Yet they no longer felt like heavy chains. They felt more like open pages in a story that was still unfolding. Maybe that is where many of us find ourselves too. Not at the end of every struggle, but somewhere in the middle of a life that is still becoming. And perhaps that is enough. Ethan looked back on the nights when tears felt endless and hope seemed impossible to find. If he could speak to the version of himself who sat alone in the darkness, he would not offer complicated answers. He would simply sit beside him and say, "You are going to make it through this. Not because you are strong every day, but because you do not have to carry everything by yourself." One of the gentlest truths in life is that healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes little by little. A moment of peace, a deeper breath, a kinder thought toward yourself, a quiet reminder that your story is worth continuing. And before you realize it, those small moments begin to create a new future. As evening settled across the sky, Ethan felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not excitement, not certainty, something even quieter and more lasting. Peace, the kind that allows a weary soul to rest. The kind that whispers that there is still beauty ahead, even if you cannot see it all yet. So if your heart feels tired tonight, if your path feels longer than you expected, remember this gentle truth. The night is not the whole story. There is still light ahead. There is still love surrounding you. And your journey, dear friend, is only beginning its most beautiful chapter.